Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how violence impacts global health, particularly how it impacts those marginalized groups or those groups at greater risk for health disparities. And let's define the problem. So, violence is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. And that is the World Health Organization's verbatim description from 2002 when they did a report on global violence. And it is 100% preventable. We might not be able to prevent malaria or Ebola 100%, but violence absolutely can be prevented. Why is nonviolence a global health priority? Why is it a critical concern of the Sisters of Mercy? Well, stopping violence is the essence of primary prevention. If we were to stop violence against children, violence against women, violence against other groups of people, we could eliminate a lot of the source of health disparity. Violence directly impacts the health of billions of people each year. It directly causes death, injury, and permanent disability. Additionally, the psychological and emotional trauma resulting from being a victim of violence impacts mental health, can create disorders like anxiety and depression. And for people with severe mental health disease, it's associated with a worse prognosis. And it increases risky health behaviors such as substance use, smoking, and overeating. And that doesn't even address when we talk about ACEs or those adverse childhood experiences where actual other unrelated conditions or seemingly unrelated conditions, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, are impacted. Your risk goes way up if you've experienced childhood trauma. And that is true also of adults who experience trauma. They are at greater risk for other diseases as well. And now for that statistic that's really appalling. Over one half of all the world's children aged 2 through 17 have suffered some form of abuse just in the past 12 months, not over the course of their lives, but just in the last year. More than half of the world's kids have been abused in some way. One out of every 3 women globally either will be physically abused by an intimate partner or sexually abused by a non-partner in the span of a lifetime. People who identify as LGBTQIA+ are 4 times more likely to be victims of violence than those who do not, and they suffer self-inflicted violence at highly disproportionate rates. And homicide, interpersonal violence, caused 475,000 deaths in 2019. And for every homicide that's been committed, think of all the people who lived with injury and emotional trauma, who maybe, they didn't die. And it's many people are impacted by violence all over the world, primarily in those groups that already have less agency for themselves. The economic cost for violence, interpersonal violence, is up to, in some cases, 11%, it depends on the year, of the global gross domestic product annually. That's how much it costs to clean up the mess of this violent world. And think of all that money that could be spent on things that are far more sustainable for the future. As of 2020, 2 billion people were living in countries affected by armed conflict, or what we term collective violence, war. That is the highest number since 1945. And now Ukraine's numbers, it's been exponential since Ukraine and Russia have been at war. 89.3 million people in this world have been forcibly displaced in 2020 because of conflict. And that all of that diverts resources for all those sustainable development goals, like climate change and clean water. If it's all going for that, and we're creating more groups of vulnerable people, that's why we don't have enough resources to care for them and to improve health. And we're actually going backwards on many of the sustainable development goals in many countries. And what's important to note about collective violence or violence against big groups of people is that even when you call a ceasefire, interpersonal violence continues in conflict-ridden nations or nations with a history of conflict. For example, right now there's a ceasefire in Yemen, but sexual violence towards women is still very high. And the same was true when Sierra Leone had their civil war, and rape was used as a weapon. The war ended, but rape did not. 20 years later, it's still happening, or 30 years later. And so violence reaps violence, and it becomes, an exponential thing. Different forms of violence can include interpersonal violence, and that's, the most prevalent. That includes child maltreatment, which we've already heard some stuff on. We're going to hear some more. Intimate partner violence, sexual violence, elder abuse, youth violence, which includes gang violence, bullying, homicide. Those are types of interpersonal violence. Then we have suicide and self-harm, which is still included in violence. Um, and then there's collective violence, which includes war or armed conflict, institutional violence. So, the kind of violence that you might see for incarcerated people, gang violence, riots, and terrorism. Those would be acts of collective violence where they sort of happen on a larger scale. Some risk factors for violence. Think about it. It's all your social determinants. In terms of what puts you at risk, older people and younger people who have less agency for themselves, people who are less able to advocate for themselves, they can't fight back. Education as a protective factor. It does not prevent violence 100%, but people who use alcohol or drugs are at risk for violence. And very often it's because of the behaviors that they have to maintain that disorder. And a childhood history of abuse or trauma can make you, in the case of women, it makes you 16 times more likely to be the victim of intimate partner violence. In the case of males, makes them 14 times more likely to become perpetrators of violence on others. Relationship level. People with multiple partners, people who have marital conflict, but in many countries you see childhood marriage, arranged or forced marriages, and those practices on a societal level tend to create gender inequities and set up conditions for intimate partner violence. On community levels, these are a lot of your SDG goals will come into play. So poverty, lack of social support, employment opportunities. If you don't have that agency for yourself, you can't really advocate for yourself. You don't have the opportunity to leave a situation that's violent. To that, you could add crime. If you live in a very violent community where there are a lot of guns and there's a lot of alcohol use, if you ever do a windshield survey for community health and you kind of see what things look like, if most of the social outlet in a given community is alcohol related, that's going to play into the citizens level for violence. On a societal level, gender inequalities and gender attitudes where a culture feels that men are superior and they are allowed domination over women. Acceptance of violence, which includes acceptance of guns, acceptance of alcohol practices, and just an overall tolerance. And it also includes whether or not criminals who are violent, especially violent towards women or children, are they prosecuted? Is it reported? Are the practices for reporting and prosecution sound? Cultural practices in some countries, there are honor killings. And in other countries, they have virginity testing, which is a form of sexual violence. And then, as I said, laws and policies. If your legal system, your judicial system is corrupt and low resource, you don't have the resources to pursue prosecution of violent offenders, then there's no consequence. And that promotes violence as well. And so these would be things that would be targeted for intervention at different levels. And we're just going to talk about how violence impacts, in particular, some of these vulnerable populations. I don't have time to go through all of them because you would be listening to me forever, and you don't want that. But child maltreatment. So this is a much, much bigger problem than most people realize. So 1 out of 2 children or 1 billion children suffer some form of violence each year. And you'll see down here, World Health Organization collected this data. Nearly 3 in 4 children aged 2 to 4 years, this is around the world, regularly suffer, not have ever suffered. And these are 2 to 4 years, little kids. 3 out of 4 regularly suffer physical punishment and or psychological violence at the hands of parents and caregivers, the people they're supposed to trust the most. That is a horrible number. 1 in 4 children age under 4 live with a mother who's a victim of intimate partner violence. 1 in 3 students around the world, aged 11 through 15, suffered bullying in the past month, just in the last 30 days. And the number was higher for boys at 35% than it was for girls at 30%, but still high. 1 in 3 students aged 13 to 15 years were in a physical fight in the past year, even 25% of girls. I mean, we usually think of that as being a boy problem. 120 million girls and young women under 20 years of age have suffered some form of forced sexual contact. That is just really appalling. And in the countries where child marriage is allowed, it's sort of sanctioned, like by everyone in the community. 40,150 deaths from violence per year in children under the age of 17. Unacceptable. And then you get into lesser forms of violence like bullying or, online bullying. But now let's talk just a little bit about ACEs, or those adverse childhood experiences. And I know you get a lot more of this in community, but people who experience those ACEs, 7 times more likely to be involved in interpersonal violence on either side of that, and 30 times more likely to attempt suicide. So again, you see violence breeding violence. And what it cost. Just here in the United States, it cost us $228 billion to maintain child protection services that really didn't do such a great job. And in South Africa, they spent $13.5 billion in violence against children, even though the rate is higher in that country, in that area of the world. Gender-based violence includes, obviously, intimate partner violence of all kinds, sexual violence, which in some countries is sort of endemic. If you take 415 or took 415, you'll hear about Sierra Leone and the DRC, the Sudan, very similar. Female genital mutilation or cutting, usually done to a girl before she's old enough to consent. Very, very young girls, done under very unsanitary conditions. Forced and early marriages to ease family financial burdens. Femicide, just the fact that women are murdered more often, and human trafficking. So those are some of the kinds of abuse that you see with women, and the fact that it happens to 1 in 3 should be fairly sobering. Some facts about elder abuse. About 1 out of 6 worldwide, but if you have dementia, you can triple that risk compared to people without cognitive impairment. And it is vastly underreported. Only about 1 in 24 cases of abuse and only 1 in 57 cases of neglect are ever reported. And usually, depending on where you are, very little is ever done about it. And it can be defined as physical abuse. Neglect or abandonment is the most common kind. Psychological abuse, financial exploitation is very common as well, and sexual abuse of the elderly. And usually 90% of the perpetrators, again, are the people that were entrusted to care for these folks. So family members and healthcare workers, the people who really were the trusted caregivers. In the elderly, abuse can lead to injury, permanent disability, mental health issues such as depression. It can also lead to death, and it aggravates pre-existing health conditions. So that's just some information on the data concerning elder abuse. So what is the World Health Organization trying to do about it? Well, they have developed a number of initiatives, and they do support a number of citizen-led groups in their violence prevention unit. And there's a whole report on it. If you want it, I'll send you a link. But their idea is to promote sustainable citizen-led initiatives that strengthen nonviolent social norms. For example, when they're talking about gender-based violence, There is a whole movement on engaging men and boys and using respected members of the community as the voice for that campaign. Um, and usually people know their communities well, and they know, what the factors are, and they know how to address those. So that is a really important campaign. Parent and caregiver support. A lot of these social determinants of health play into intimate partner violence, elder abuse, and child maltreatment. People who are stressed financially, people living in extreme poverty, people whose only coping mechanism is alcohol, they are much more likely to perpetrate abuse in their families. So providing those supports in their families and normalizing nurturing behavior and giving people the skills. So there's like a whole parenting program for each age group, and it's administered through schools and other community agencies. That is also important. But none of it works if you don't address the social determinants of health, if you don't address poverty and lack of education, and access to alcohol and access to guns. If you don't do those things, um, your impact will not be as effective. Another initiative that is part of the violence prevention unit is to decrease stigma and silence for survivors. Very often they're ostracized in their community. In those communities where rape is so common, girls and women don't want to come forward because they are thought to have initiated it, even though they were powerless against it. And their families may disown them. And if they report it, um, there's a lot of pressure sometimes on the families to disown the person. So decreasing that second injustice is another thing that they do. And then they provide a lot of guidance to different government agencies to promote legislation and policies that reduce violence and increase prosecution of perpetrators. So things like gun control, they would advocate for that. Stiffer penalties for anyone who commits sexual violence to a child under the age of 18. Those kind of initiatives have been successful at reducing the level of violence. And lastly, they collect and disseminate data to inform decision making. Was policy effective? What worked best? What was the most effective intervention? What's the most cost effective intervention? And so that they can sustain that effort over time and make it better. And that is all I have for you. So I hope it wasn't too painful. And now go into the discussion board, delve into the country of your choice, and address violence and address one of those groups that are living within that country, and talk about how a sustainable project might work to reduce the incidence of violence for that group.